from a laudable inclination, which is at the core of African history. It's to focus on the African experiences of refugees in this case, going or thinking further with the strong tradition of reflecting on the negotiation of African ages. However, I think that we can only contextualize those refugee experiences if we think about the larger role of the African refugee regime in the making at that point in time. So different African historical actors, amongst them upper-class men working as diplomats and as politicians, played a crucial role in shaping the thinking about an emerging concept of the refugee at the time. So what I wonder if my fuller history looked like in that wanted foregrounded possibilities and limits of a host of African actors contributing to shaping the international refugee regime. This is then how I came to be interested in understanding the emergence of the regime itself in the 1960s. So why did it emerge in the 1960s, and what were its main pillars? Who shaped it, and why? And what relationship did it have to the simultaneously emerging and shaping global refugee regime and its promoters such as UNHCR? So these are some of the questions that I got really interested in. To answer these questions, I primarily went to the organization of Communities Archives, which is housed on the campus of the AU in Addis Ababa. And then I went to what G. Allman calls the global shadow archives around the world. So UN Archives in New York, UNHCR in Geneva, but also organizations such as the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation in Spiegel. I'm always looking for correspondence with the OAE at the time. And so what does Africa to me in this project mean? It means literally member states of the OAU in the 1950s, but also, of course, crucially, those countries in Southern Africa that at that point in time were not liberated yet. And I'm looking at the OAU as a historical actor, but I differentiate in that book for actual people acting with this organization because I think that people make crucial difference. So today I want to attempt, if possible, and tell you about the book's main argument and what's left of my 10 minutes. That means I will only have time to focus on exactly that and I'll tell you more about the book. So if you're interested in the actual case studies, then you'll have to ask me later. I argue that the book, or that the Conference of Decolonization was a book built for the 1960s and that contemporary developing paradigms led to the politicization of the nascent refugee regime and created a historically unique moment. What was unique about this moment was that because of the confluence of this release, so Displacement, Decolonization, and Development, refugees were actually welcomed in many African states, either as freedom fighters or as potential agents of economic development. While actors like UNHCR aimed to depoliticize refugee contexts and foregrounded humanitarian imperative during the 1960s, humanitarianism took backseat to development and political imperatives across the African continent. So let's take a moment to think about the concept of the African refugee regime. The African refugee regime emerged from a complex and dynamic negotiation between a range of actors, amongst them refugees themselves, experts, politicians, lawyers, natural institutions in several African states and international governments, as well as non-governmental organizations. And key amongst government organizations was the OAE. So the regime was not fixed. Rather, it remained subject to constant negotiations, and its overall structure became visible only in hindsight. The phrase migration regime, for Christopher Rass and Frank Wolf, captures, and I quote here, the relationship between mobility, regulation, and disputes, end of quote. To my thinking, the African refugee regime then not only emerged set conventions, rules, and principles, but it was and is constituted for continued negotiation of these very legalistic decision-making procedures. Moreover, it was also a function of negotiation of humanitarian development rights. To reiterate, I understand then the African refugee regime as a set of ongoing conversations with the various actors who assess what constitutes refugee and develop different ways of responding to quote-unquote refugees that they say that could fight. The value of the term refugee regime, comprehended as an ongoing multi-level negotiation, lies precisely in openness. It allows for contingency, for understanding of powerful nations amongst different tribal actors, and it does so under a single analytic framework. I think about the negotiations that constituted the evolving refugee regime as having taken place pre-their PCS. Of course, there's first macro level. There was laws, norms, resolutions, tensions on the macro level. These were written by politicians, lawyers, actors, international organizations. And we've got the negotiation on micro level on the opposite direction, where encounters between refugees, local government officials, and relief providers negotiated the everyday practices of the regime and the practical elements of refugee visits. And then in the middle between those, we have the meso level. This included organizations like the OAU, the Organization for African Unity, as a platform for encounters between African politicians and diplomats on the one hand, but also ordinary refugees themselves. So in several of the negotiation spaces that the EU offered, refugees were actually invited as experts and consulted during the make, for instance, of the 69 refugee convention. This then was about refugee control, about defining power and attempts to direct and manage refugee movements. The OAU served as an arena for different negotiations of the regime and helped birth many of its different pillars. African foreign ministers and heads of states passed resolutions concerning refugees, and diplomats drafted the OAU's Refugee Convention. Its regular political meetings brought high-ranking politicians together. Its Refugee Commission worked to bring refugee experts and diplomats together, and the conferences it organized offered spaces for negotiation for attendees from international organizations, non-government organizations, and foreign governments. So there's a lot going on, lots of different venues to actually think through, where the organization as such was thinking about how to constitute, frame the refugee as categories. So to help us understand the OAU's role in establishing the African refugee regime in the 1960s, this book adopts James Scott's now classic approach of seeing the United States. It asks in this way, or it wants to understand how the OAU saw the concept of refugee in the 1960s and how it understood what it meant to be a refugee. Also, how its various bodies amongst the tradition actually understood and governed, refugees, how it made them visible as category, quantifiable, and consequently then governable. When we attempt to quote-unquote see refugees as the OAU quote-unquote saw them, various bodies come into focus in which refugees were conceptualized and their relationship to decolonization, state-making, and development negotiation. So the OAU then served as an observation point of the African refugee regime. The OAU draws into read the entanglements between displacement and decolonization. But there's a reason for why actually a lot of historians have hesitated to look at the OAU as an actor, and one of those reasons was the simple observation that the OAU actually ceased to exist in 2002 and transformed into AU. But just that because an organization ceased to exist is usually not a very good reason not to historically study it. And we should not forget the 1960s was a time period of a lot of hope, a lot of innovation, a lot of trust also in solving political matters. And for instance, decolonization was key of the agenda of the OAU at the time, which did actually also get it semi-resolved in the lifetime of the organization. And so it was also setting itself to go to, and here's, I'm using the parlance of time, quote, to solve the refugee problem. So the idea was really we will solve, it will not be a refugee problem after the 1960s. And yes, refugee problem is so issue. So in that sense, I think it's really important that we turn our gaze back to the 1960s, think about that moment in history, where actors thought about why do we need to have the category of refugee rebut on the continent? How do we need to rethink this? Because it's currently based on a European history of displacement. And then they drew up their own prevention to transform that into legal aspects. They founded a refugee education bureau, which would send the refugees everywhere on scholarships to build future leaders for then to be liberated nations. They were also thinking about something that we still continue thinking about, which is refugee resettlement in terms of zonal development. So there's lots of things that we can sort of think through how it was originally discussed in the 1960s and what it means then for today. And that's what I hope to be doing. But thank you very much.